Good. So we know that from the sources that amulets were considered to be more potent, more powerful when on the body, on the flesh, and not through a kind of, through textile. In the case of the Breslov necklace, the only proper pictorial evidence you've seen, and that's overgarments. And you wouldn't really need a décolleté like a Hollywood star. And this is not, I can't imagine that in Byzantium that this was worn like this. I mean, the evidence we have doesn't look like it. But it would work quite well because you would have one Mary directly connected to your, basically to your heart. But it must have been worn over something. Yeah.
Well, I'm also interested that it's enamel. So you've got gems that are clear, see-through, whatever. They go both ways. The enamel is opaque, so they've done that on both sides. You know, maybe it's thought of as impenetrable, so therefore you have to have both sides.
Cynthia, I have a question for you. Thank you so much for your paper. I was thinking when you showed us the Fields comparison and the Doubting Thomas. Christ is always standing in front of the door in Doubting Thomas scenes, and so which is again about touch and seeing, right? And so I started thinking about the Flial. Is this also a metaphor for touch? Because it is about subjection to some form of violence, but it's also about touch, and it goes together with the sight, right? Which is again these two things that also in Doubting Thomas, it's always the scene, and it's always in front of the door, as if are these things that the touch will not give you access to the other world, or seeing and believing will in a way.
Yeah,
in Doubting Thomas.
I think you're saying more about Doubting Thomas maybe than you are about these images. These don't necessarily refer to Doubting Thomas, but Doubting Thomas may itself have the same kind of meaning because of the door. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then the fair is becoming something else, and I wonder what it actually becomes.
The which is
the flail.
The flail. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's becoming a. It's vegetable.
What is it
it's
becoming?
Yeah.
No, but what is it? No, but what is it becoming as a symbol or as a metaphor, rather than the actual function of these two?
Oh, you mean the little actual one?
Yeah.
The silver one. Yeah, I read somebody who wrote a blog post on it. The only thing I could find about it at all, the British Museum has almost nothing about it. Almost really nothing. It's pure silver. And someone wrote a blog post saying, if this was ever used, it would be very blackened because it would break the skin, it would make blood, it would be very hard to clean because it's made of mesh, etc. You know, and so that their idea was that it was never used. They didn't know what used for what, but they make any of the connections I did. But I thought it was just amazing. I did find one other evidence of a metal flail, but it was much later and all broken up. That might have been actually used. Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a lot of stuff about disciplining the senses, even things I didn't put in. And I think so it's a sort of a symbol of disciplining the senses. Maybe you just kind of waved it around.
Yeah. Alicia, just a second, because people at home,
Thank you both. Those are wonderful papers. Cynthia, I have a question that ultimately is a question about gender and differences in brooches and how brooches were understood to function for people of different genders. So let me try to explain what I'm thinking. I loved this idea of the brooch being simultaneously a protective device, but also it seemed like a mnemonic device to remind yourself to protect yourself, right? Like in some cases it also did that. And I know the materials spread across quite a broad chronological range, but I was struck how early on you showed us, I think it was like a 13th century golden brooch that had the inscription indicating that it was for a woman and it was intended to protect her. So the brooch is an agent of protection. It's playing an active role, right, in protecting the woman. But your key object seemed to be an object that was more a reminder to the wearer to be vigilant. So the wearer has a capacity to protect themselves. And what I was curious about is there's often this distinction in the understanding of an individual's capacity to guard their own senses dependent on whether they're men or women. So women are generally thought to be weaker morally, right, and unable to protect themselves, whereas men or women who can behave in masculine fashion are able to protect themselves. So the question that I have is, given that gender distinction in people's capacities to make proper decisions or guard their senses and their souls, do you see a pattern of brooches that appear to be intended for women, assuming that the woman is not capable of doing that and that the brooch has to protect her in some way, as opposed to brooches that might be for men, where the understanding is they do have that capacity to be vigilant about their senses?
That's a great idea. I like it a lot, but I can't say, can you hear me? Should I use this? Yeah, I can't say that it, that I can assemble the material I know to fit that right off.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, to counter it, you know, the Edwin brooch, the one with the funny animals on it that had the inscription, that was for a woman. And it doesn't say anything about protecting the senses, but I don't know if you picked it up, but in my last words, I had to cut things out. There was something about polishing in one text to rid any spot or sin. And I love that most of these brooches are silver. And so there could be and there's also later medieval texts about polishing the mirror of the soul, looking into the mirror and polishing it so that you erase any spot of sin. So I think it's related to that kind of idea. So that these are kind of silver shields, the most typical type, I think is indicative, and at least that one is a woman's. So I'm not sure there's a gender differentiation. It's more an education, because this is so intellectualized, I think, the Alfred brooch, in a way that it really stands out, I think. And Alfred is known for being way beyond his time in terms of his literacy and working with ideas, only like clergymen, really, like, you know, other clergymen, the only that could be compared to him. His own son didn't even really pick up on it. So yeah, I wouldn't say, but I will look for it, because it's an interesting idea. And the question is really for the later ones, where it seems to be aimed at the women, and they associate with marriage more, and a man has to give his wife a brooch upon marriage and that sort of thing. That's true. What were men wearing then? They were wearing brooches too. And I'm trying to think, can I sort that through? But I'll be thinking about that now.
Meredith has a question here in the front.
So mine is slightly an observation that I would just like to hear responses to. For uniquely in this panel, you have managed to find wearable that also requires garments, that we've sort of self-divided into the jewelry and the textile people, and both of yours require garments. And I wonder if that is what kind of thoughts you have on what your jewelry demands of what people are wearing.
If you want me to. Anyway, well, I think it actually, you can't say the jewelry requires a garment. Everyone had a cloak, basically. You had to wear them and you had to have a pin for it. There wasn't really any other technology of holding your cloak on at the time. I suppose sometimes people didn't wear them around the house, so to speak, but, you know, so they were really quite necessary. And you see that as a result that there are just so many of them that survive. Yeah, I mean, I was really jumping further from that to think of the way that, okay, now I have a piece of metal that I'm supplementing my necessary clothing with. It's a necessary piece of metal. And I want to add to that. I want that value added. I want everything I can added on to that: beauty, protection, you know, functionality, et cetera, to that. And there are some examples, and you know, somebody showed one yesterday of textiles with brooches embroidered onto them. So there is a kind of there must be a kind of a fluid, you use that word, a fluid border between the kind of uses of the textiles but I don't know enough about textiles to say.
It's interesting that you asked that, because we had this discussion now about, is the necklace on the skin or not? But I believe it needs garments, because that was the only possibility. But for example, the dress appliques, they are not worn separately. All the other things you could theoretically wear without clothing, but the dress appliques need garment, and the kind of multiplication of effect. The most expensive textiles, silks, and then add gold to it, and that's over 90% gold, these little appliques. So it's not silver. Some of them are silver gilt, but most of them are gold.
Yeah, the fact that
And
pearls were sewn all over Laura, I mean, there
Yeah.
is a kind of like it just moves back and forth quite fluidly in some kinds of ways.
And it gives the clothing a volume. You get a different surface. It seems kind of worth more. It's thicker, it's heavier, and just sparkling. And like the brooches, the light effects would have been amazing.
Yeah. So maybe question to you, textile people, or maybe an observer. Have you seen not in your work either purposeful design, that is to say, design of textile that will accompany garment or be ready in terms of potential wear, or wear from wearing jewelry?
I don't know if
Meredith?
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to say, one thing that I have always found really fascinating about this issue of jewelry or metalwork that would be sewn onto garments is like the practicality of that, right? You know, once you stitch them on to a garment, you can't move them off, you know, like there's like a practical issue there that I find fascinating and I don't know what to do with.
If you have
And that
the stuff.
osseous, yeah, well, and that the so-called osseous collar is really interesting because the backside of it, there are Greek letters that are telling someone how to assemble it. In theory, it's like you go A, B, C, D, E, and you would put the individual pieces onto something, right? And so I think that there are indications in the objects themselves that must have been confusing or needed, like there was something practically about that must have been a challenge or it required an intervention. So yeah, just a comment back on that. And Itai, to answer your question maybe a little.
Yeah.
But there was one
Debbie?
question.
Should I wait for the mic?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yeah, because the mic, no, the people at home cannot hear you if you don't.
Oh,
hold
that's
the mic.
So yeah, thank you both. Thank you both for those papers. Very, very interesting and thought-provoking. I wonder whether with the brooches, it's this kind of geeky material question, but you didn't show the backs and how many of them still have the pins, and in terms of how the pins are attached and how much space there is between, you know, if you put a brooch on and there's not enough, if it's a thick piece of fabric that you're joining, you know, let's say a thick, rough wool, there has to be quite a lot of space between how the pin is attached and where, you know, you have to be able to grab that amount of fabric in it. And I wonder whether there's anything that can be concluded from studying the backs of these things about the kinds of textiles or the gender of the wearer. And do we know enough about what cloaks were made of? I assume they're made of wool, they're outer garments, they're probably pretty coarse. How much of this material really survives from the period? What shape is it in? And, you know, a lot of questions that could follow from looking at the backs. And I wonder, is that research that you've done or that's been done by other people?
The British Museum, which is one place where I've seen a lot of these, you know, I mean, in terms of my research, they, the website, a lot of this has had to be done during COVID. So I've been using websites. They are spotty in terms of showing the backs, but I would say from the curatorial descriptions, the pins are almost always broken. So that doesn't help us very much, but the back is still going to be of interest. You know, that Syrian object had an inscription on the back. I would like to see the backs always, but you don't always get to see them. And again, and then you're asking about the fabric, and that's a great question, but I am not competent to go there. That actually, I'm making a really gross assumption that this is for the outer cloak, but I'm sure they were worn in other ways too, on things that they wore ceremonially, which wouldn't have been big, heavy cloaks. So then you're asking what kind of fabric that was, and it's a real, so to speak, kettle of fish. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I'm not sure I would ever be able to go through the kind of amount of data you'd have to do that.
But also things that are from archaeological context, graves probably have much better survival of things like the
Almost a lot of these are archaeological already, yes.
Right. But nevertheless,
the
that
Fuller brooch is unique in that it seems to have been passed down without getting there.
That would be the first thing that would be replaced if you were trying to make it sort of update it, right? You would want to fix it so you could put it on. So that would be another question, is how authentic the pins are, the ones that survive.
I'm sorry, are you asking whether some of them were repaired?
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody say that, but I would bet that some of them are. You know, it really, you're depending on the museum personnel and how much they include or the archaeologists and what they include. And it's surprising to me. I was actually at a conference not so long ago, an archaeologist was saying whether she was creating a giant database, and she actually asked the question, there are these bundles. Should I make that a category and say what's in the bundle, or should I catalog them separately? I said, tell us bundles. We want to know about the bundles. It's like unbelievable that somebody today would be asking that question. You want that kind of information. What are they traveling with, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I think it sounds great. And, you know, get a student on it. I'm like, really beyond that. As I said at the beginning, my project is very, very broad because, and I think probably many of you sympathize with this. A lot of us are working in this field. It tends, when I very started working on jewelry, I was at the Institute for Advanced Study, and I found that I couldn't say I'm working on jewelry and get an appropriate response. Yeah. I would get this turn aside look. I mean, I had to come up with other ways of saying it so that people would find it properly compelling. And so this book is really in some way a large argument to say, this is the way people created identity. This is the way they expanded and amplified their bodily presence in order to be what they are. And you know, so I'm looking at really bigger picture things. Yeah, but it's a really good question. Sorry.
Yes, Sarah. Thanks.
Thank you for these wonderful papers. They've also been such a feast for the eyes. So I'm looking forward to seeing more. But I have a question for Cynthia that may be a bit of a naive question coming from a sinologist. It's about the Fuller brooch. The figure in the center, you mentioned it's unusual because it's a figural scene, but the face in the center looks to me animal-esque. It seems to have sort of the appearance of a sheep or a hare or something with the cleft palate. And I wonder how that affects the interpretation of it. I didn't really notice the surrounding figures, whether they had those features, but I wondered if you could comment on that.
They do all have those features. That's the way they make faces. Yeah, so that's an interesting observation, given that figures are so unusual in metalwork and they usually do animals. It may be a purposeful kind of classifying of the animal kingdom as important in a way that doesn't mean figures supersede them, but it could be just an effect of what this artist does.
Thank you.
Yes, Alicia.
Yeah, it seems to have gone off.
There it is. Okay, Antje, I wanted to, I think this is maybe more a comment than a question, but I wanted to thank you so much for raising this issue about the jewelry being hung and part of a kind of architectural decoration. And we know that this also is done with textiles in the palace. But you really kind of started sort of an unraveling in my mind about the fact that maybe, as you were suggesting, these objects are designed with that in mind. Like not only, we always think about how did this appear in the body, but you're making me wonder whether they were actually designed from the beginning with thought to also how they're going to look hung between columns or hung in the palace, which I think is, to me, actually, that's actually a really radical game changer about what notions of design could be going into these objects from the beginning. And it also suggests to me something really radically different in how I've been thinking about the wearable. Even though I said this in my paper, it's something I really struggle with, is how do we think about bodies and buildings or bodies and spaces being on a sort of level playing field in terms of where and how identity is being communicated. And I think about this especially in the case of the palace, because the palace, even the word, is the palace, the space, but it's also the palace, the community, the group of people. There's a real sort of elision between the people and the space. And you often, when one looks at these imperial portraits, it's always sort of struck me that the bodies are kind of these sites where all this stuff gets placed, right? Their little heads poke out, their faces poke out, but they're really kind of just a site, much like a wall, right? So, you know, I'm really just reiterating what you said, but I just wanted to emphasize like how I think there are really deep implications for what you're drawing attention to. And if I do have a question that comes out of this, it's you being someone who really looks at these technical features. Has this started to change the way you think about how a piece of jewelry is designed so that it's going to hang appropriately, not just on a body, but also on a wall or what have you? Because you did talk about like how certain chains were really, really strong, and that implies that there's an attention to their durability and being able to be hung. But you know, in the same way that you were attending to how that collar would fit around the neck and have implications then for how the pendants lie, is this causing you to think differently as you look at technical features, to think not only like how did this hang on a body, but how would this have now hung on a wall or between columns? Would you go so far as to say that they're actually designing this jewelry, anticipating not just how it looks on a building, but also, excuse me, not just how it looks in a body, but also how it's going to look in a space?
Especially I'm thinking about the 10 centimeter with white necklace, which was, yes, it always seems something is more for the space than the body.
Yeah, the diameter is, you can actually put it on a reasonably thin neck, but you can kind of fold it through the hinges between the elements. So you can kind of unfold it, put it around the neck and close it again. You don't have to kind of break it open. And that's the one thing. And the chemist who analyzed the necklace, she was a very petite French woman, and it looked fabulous on her. She wore it over a black roll neck. We were not supposed to say that. So it was made for the body, but hanging it up is actually problematic. I don't know how they did that in times before plexiglass.
Do you know the Escrin de Charlemagne? Have you ever seen that? It doesn't exist anymore, but there's a drawing of it. It was destroyed in the French Revolution. And there is just one engraved gem that survives from it. It's an antique reused gem. It may be intended, is it Livia? It's probably supposed to be the Virgin Mary at the top of this thing, but it's an architectural screen, and it has little things hanging, which I always thought of as crowns, but now I'm starting to think other things. You know, you might want to look at that and think about that object in terms, it's in my book, Strange Beauty. I have a picture of it. And I'm also, it made me think of, I understand from you, Byzantinus, that these pieces of clothing were kept in a treasury as well for long time. Do they wind up representing the bodies that wore them? And would the jewelry then, if it's actually fitted to a small neck, be preserved and be a kind of a ghost of that previous empress in display? I mean, that kind of sounds like fun.
Yeah, like wax figures in the basement of Westminster Abbey, right?
Well, yeah.
Kings, almost. You have the history. Yeah, you have the
But if you hang
I think you have something like this in the Forbidden City, no? So like a collection of emperors' clothes from the past that is preserved.
Well, you certainly have it for bishops in Episcopals. Yeah. So Episcopal things, and they become relics.
They're in treasure. So that like in maybe Byzantium. So also in Westminster, there's nobody access to that place, right? But Antje, I kind of interrupted you from answering it. So, and then we went in.
It all comes together.
Yeah.
because I'm such a practical person myself, this hanging up really made me think. I have no solution for that, because if you hang it up on the two hinges, it would put too much strain on the soft gold. So it would have had to have something, and I really don't know. You couldn't hang them up like the crowns. So, but it must have been possible. I mean, they would have had, I have no pictorial evidence, but maybe the one you mentioned
is so odd.
would be worth looking into it.
But you know, by definition, it's going to be odd because it was made out of gems, and of course it got melted down at some point. You know, any kind of structure like that wouldn't. But where did they get the idea? Charlemagne. It doesn't. It sounds Byzantine influenced, so to speak.
Yeah, or Islamic, right? Or
Islamic. Yeah.
Who knows?
Courtly, at any rate. Very,
yeah.
International courtly. Let's call it that.
Yeah. I have a question for you. Maybe thinking of Irene's talk yesterday about the Yuan dynasty looking back to other dynasties and the idea of thinking about adornment backwards. And in the Byzantine court, as we saw today from your presentation, they're always moving forward in the design. It's always changes. And I wonder if there's actually evidence of, let's say, antiquarian thinking or thinking of past generations of wearers when we are designing the new garments for the new emperors. Is there a discourse that is kind of like back looking, or looking into, let's say, the catalog, the back catalog of the imperial court when designing something new?
I cannot really say, but when I looked at St. Helena on the Esztergom Saurotape, I thought this was maybe a more kind of backward thinking with a visible neck, but it's just an idea. So maybe some of you have an idea about that, about the garments. I mean, they only change slowly. We're not talking about a new fashion. They were really rather traditional in general.
Right, but they are constantly changing themselves. They're not preserving the older designs, which is in itself very interesting. So when we were thinking about comparativism, these two courts, how they operate regarding, regarding royal dresses is an interesting way to think about these questions. 5 to 12, we'll be back here at 1 p.m. Thank you very much, both of our speakers. And